and I call it the futures, plural. Because recently I've started to immerse myself a little more academically into the subject of future studies. Some might consider this subject maybe as odd as laying tarot cards and reckoning the whole future thing a pseudoscience. And yet we all have to admit that man's desire for a better understanding of the future is actually as old as humankind itself. For instance, the history of astrology, which is the search for meaning in the sky, goes back for thousands of years. And honestly, it's due to those early astrologists that we have learned how to measure times in terms of reoccurring celestial bodies and constellations and things. And some people figured out these constellations were connected to annual phases, which led to the development of like early calendars, and a little later we got things like sundials, and then clocks, and eventually Apple watches, which has nothing to do with astrology anymore. And yet it's but another attempt to predict weather and seasons and to control time. And it reveals the desire to be prepared for upcoming events. We are all actually trying to manipulate our own future, even if we would describe it in different words. Now, thanks to CA/Communitas, I've been working more or less professionally within the field of future research myself for almost 1.5 decades. And in my particular case, we were stressing the need to pave the way for the church of the future after the millennium shift and during times of tremendous change. And for the past 15 years or so, we've been observing and evaluating things like global trends or local developments and sociological phenomena. And according to our learning curve, based on the data that we collected on a pretty small scale, I might need to add, we did ongoing experiments with different forms of approaches of being church that should be ready for the 21st century. And now in 2020, my personal and most astonishing takeaway from our work so far is that the church of the future is not so much about new church forms or hipper meeting places or groovier worship. Most people, including myself, would have expected that, especially when we were starting with this project. Sort of, if we only had to paint this church building in a new fancy color, it's going to work again, but it won't. Yeah, I've seen very cool church plans failing gloriously while burning concerning amounts of donations on the latest stage equipment, and the most expensive locations in town, but nobody was showing up or showing interest anyway. And those church planting teams, and I think of one particular team right now that has prepared for years for a huge launch they were talking about of that new fancy church, they saw the future probably as accurately as Thomas Watson. Have you heard that name? It's the former IBM CEO, and he said in 1943, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. On the other hand, I've also seen very old and liturgical churches filled with students, with life, with families, with old people, showing up actually randomly during the week just for prayer and community. So here are 2 options, either a fresh, fancy failure or an old, charming church antique. If only those 2 scenarios would be given to you for your own church planting career, which one would you pick? And of course, life is very complex, and there will always be much more and conceivable scenarios. God, however, gave his own people only 2 scenarios as well. In the Torah, he starts with giving his law to Israel, and at the end of it, he paints 2 surprisingly large and colorful pictures for the people. And picture 1 is, if you are going to follow the law, God says, this is what is going to happen with you guys. And then he describes a forecast of several centuries. However, God continues, if you are not going to follow the law, that is going to happen to you. And it follows a forecast just as long and detailed as the first, yet very different. And then God says, now you pick. It's your choice, and it's your choice alone. And this passage liberates us from at least 2 misconceptions, as far as I see it. 1, we are not puppets on a string, scampering around like, some puppet according to some sort of overpowering director who some might call fate, or some might call climate change, or some might call God, religious people. No, says God, I'm no puppeteer. The choice is all yours. And number 2 is, there isn't only one future, fixed and set in stone. The only future possible, the one that we all desire to figure out magically. Like, what the heck is going to happen today or this year? Who is it I'm going to fall in love with? All too often we narrow the future down to only one option with no detours or other alternatives. Apparently, mankind enjoys to believe in the one future only option, and that we, or that those who own the magical crystal ball that can predict it all, gains a lot of power. And we can see this in history, the Oracle of Delphi, we see it in horoscopes. For some weird reason, it's alarmingly easy for all of us, I guess, to fall for that sort of thinking. But God tells again, no, there is no historical heavenly screenplay manuscript. I give you 2 possible futures, Israel. And of course, life was much simpler for Israel back in the day, in the desert, somewhere between Egypt and the Promised Land. But having to pick one preferable future out of 2 options appears to be already a little too overwhelming for poor Israel. History shows that Israel apparently wanted to have it all, like both options, right? So what about us today in the 21st century? Unlike Israel, we have a whole IKEA megastore filled with possible future options to choose from. Now that is truly overwhelming, and therefore it is understandable why the preferred solution of larger church circles would be to create our own postmodern Amish paradise, escaping from all the churches and all the responsibilities God has given to us, where we can feel safe and we don't have to think too much about it. And this might be an explanation why the church of our time is mostly known for living in the past. For unlike futures, there is only one past, and it's explainable, and it's safe, and it cannot be changed. We can, and we do often, discuss it forever and let others determine our future. We'll start talking about the future once it has passed into the past. Which is probably a major reason why some of the recent global grassroots movements, like Friday for Future, were not started by Christians. Church leaders, I think, need to relearn how to embrace the future, how to think future, how to plan future. Our law is not the Torah, but actually the Sermon on the Mount. Yet both can be summarized with love God and love your neighbor. What would the world look like in 10, in 20, or in 30 years if every member of any church in the entire world would be truly and seriously discipled in living out the Sermon on the Mount? What would our world look like in this case? And what would the world look like if every Christian in the whole planet would completely cease to follow the Sermon on the Mount? And when you take a look around you, which of those two scenarios I just described is closer to the current condition of the planet? And finally, let me reveal part 2 of my most astonishing takeaway after 15 years of paving the way, or attempts to pave the way for the church of the future. As already mentioned, it's not about the forms of the church. It is actually about the discipleship of the future. It's all about the question, how then shall we live, as Francis Schaeffer would have put it. It's about the discovery how much the Bible has to say about discipleship, even in and to the 21st century and beyond. Of course, we can keep discipling like it's 1969, or we can try to make disciples who are ready for 2029. And that is what I have experienced in these old churches, where people show up, they have content that speak to life as it is today, and they give different options. They give different types of counterbalances to weigh these out, these unbalances. The futures are ours, as are the choices. And Jesus is surely with us, always, to the very end, until the end of the age.